Welcome back to A Good Length. I'm Dr. Vinuba Mitting, and thank you for tuning in again. As a father, you love your children more than you love your own life. We work hard to provide for our family, and we do our best to be as present as we possibly can. Now imagine one day the relationship suddenly ends, and almost overnight, everything you understood about your role as a father and your rights as a parent, your financial future as a man, every single one of those assumptions gets fed into a machine that was not at all designed with you in mind. Welcome to the Australian child support system. Today we're going to talk about why that machine is structurally and morally broken, and what a genuinely fair system would look like if we had the courage to build one. Firstly, I'm not here to pretend every father is a victim or a saint, because that's obviously not the case. Nor am I demonizing women or saying that every mother is a villain, because there are plenty of examples of women doing it tough, raising children on their own, while the father is voluntarily absent. This is not an episode about how women are screwing over men. That's not it at all. What I want to do is hold up a mirror to a system that was built on a set of assumptions about gender, parenting, and economics that are decades out of date, and articulate the damage it's doing to children, to men and women, as well as family units. This is about challenging the system to drive much needed modernization and structural reform that is required to keep up with the changing societal values and cultural landscape. And the core truth is this: the child support system, as it's currently designed, does not truly follow nor ensure the child support money goes directly to the child. It just merely transfers wealth between adults and then calls it justice. Supporting a child is morally righteous, and I will go out on a limb and say that most, not all, but most fathers would willingly sacrifice almost anything for their children. But there is a profound difference between directly supporting a child and being compelled to hand over money to your ex-partner with little to no transparency, accountability, and absolutely no meaningful oversight regarding how that money is ultimately used. And that is the extraordinary and ridiculous contradiction at the heart of the system. The state assumes that transferring money to the primary caregiver automatically translates into benefit for the child. And sometimes it does. But sometimes it simply subsidizes the lifestyle, choices, or financial priorities of the receiving adult, while the paying parent is told to accept this blindly under the banner of morality. There is not a private entity, successful business, or corporation that would tolerate this level of financial opacity, or lack thereof. Forget private enterprises, there's no government department in the world that would tolerate public funds being distributed without accountability mechanisms. Yet, when it comes to child support, society is expected to believe that intention alone, without any necessity to provide evidence, is sufficient oversight. The concept of financially supporting a child is fair, it's ethical, and it's necessary. But the height of foolishness is epitomized by a system that often cannot distinguish between supporting children and redistributing income between former partners, and then condemning anyone who questions that distinction. Because once a system removes transparency, accountability, and any direct connection between contribution and outcome, resentment becomes inevitable. Not because parents, regardless of gender, don't want to provide for their children, but because human beings instinctively recoil when responsibility exists without visibility, without reciprocity, and without trust. To understand why the system needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, you need to understand what it's actually doing. In Australia, the child support is calculated by a child support agency, now operating under Services Australia, using what is called an administrative formula. That formula takes into account the income of both parents, the number of children, and, this is the critical part, the percentage of nights the children spend with each parent. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, proportional, even logical. But here is a problem. The percentage of nights a child spends with a parent is not a neutral parenting variable, it's a financial lever. And once money is attached to it, everything changes. When custody time directly determines how much money one parent receives from the other, you've created a system where time with children is not just purely a parenting decision, it's a vehicle for financial negotiation. Custodial time serves as a thinly veiled surrogate for monetary gain. The more nights you have, the more money flows your way. And the fewer nights the other parent has, the more money they pay. So in essence, you have, whether you've intended to or not, turned children into financial assets. And men, as the higher earners in majority, but not all, separated households, and as the parents more likely to be the secondary carer, are disproportionately the one writing the checks. When nights with your children determines dollars in your account, custody stops being about the children and starts being about economics. The Australian Institute of Family Studies has consistently found that mothers retain primary care in majority of post-separation arrangements. The 2019 report on parenting arrangements after separation found that in about 68% of cases, mothers were the primary residential parent. And that's not a judgment on mothers, just the facts. And in many cases, it reflects the genuine primary carer roles that existed during the relationship. But the system's financial architecture then amplifies that arrangement, rewarding one parent financially for the very custody outcome that the system itself makes difficult to challenge. And here is where it becomes a trap, because when you realize that receiving 66% of nights rather than 50% could mean the difference of thousands of dollars per year in income in child support, you've created an enormous incentive to resist shared care. Not because you are a bad parent, not because the other parent is dangerous, but because the financial system has made it rational to do so. And here's what most Australians do not know about the child support system. The system is not a simple, gradual sliding scale. It has cliffs. Services Australia divides care into bands. That is, less than regular care, shared care, primary care, and more than primary care. And one of the most important thresholds is 35% care. At 34% care, you are still treated as having regular care. At 35% care, you cross over into shared care. That 1% point can materially change the child support calculation. But the even bigger threshold is 66% care. Once a parent reaches primary care, which is roughly 10 to 12 nights per fortnight, Services Australia says the parent does not have to pay child support. Let me say that again. The magic number is not moral, it's mathematical. 10 nights a fortnight can be the difference between being a child support payer and not being one. So when people say, why would anyone fight so hard for a few extra nights, this is part of that answer. Because the system has built financial consequences around care percentages. And once money is attached to nights, the system stops measuring care. It starts incentivizing custody and starts transforming a child's time into a surrogate for monetary gain. That is not a bug in the system. That is the system working exactly as designed and producing exactly the outcomes we should have predicted. Yet we continue to watch this play out in front of our eyes, while we mutter quietly under our breath and direct that bitterness towards the other parent, thereby perpetuating the conflict of resentment that keeps our legal industry gainfully employed. So what is the fix? The first and most fundamental reform is ridiculously simple. We absolutely and definitively need to uncouple financial obligations from custody time. In other words, financial obligations should have nothing to do with the number of nights a child sleeps in your home, regardless of if you're the mother or the father. And I know that sounds radical. And the immediate and obvious pushback is going to be, well, if you have the children more, you spend more. That's true. And we will get to how that gets handled in a minute. But the overarching macro principle that the custody time should not generate a financial transfer between adults, that is the load-bearing wall of any genuine reform. Remove the financial reward from custody, and you remove the financial incentive to weaponize custody. Think about what happens the moment you make that change. Immediately, the strategic calculation shifts. A parent who previously had every incentive to maximize their custody time, not because they were the better or more available parent, but because more nights meant more money. That calculation evaporates. Custody becomes, once again, a question of what is best for the child and what promotes and honors both parents' genuine relationships with their children and what is optimal for child development. It becomes a genuine parenting question instead of one being financially tainted. Remove the financial incentives and you will watch the adversarial legal battles over custody shrink. Not because the law forced it, but because the motivation to fight has been removed. The research on this is pretty clear. Children consistently do better with meaningful access to both parents. The American Psychological Association, the Australian Family Law researchers, and longitudinal studies across multiple countries all point to the same conclusion. Shared parenting, when safe and achievable, produces better outcomes across every measurable dimension: academic, psychological, relational, and behavioral. We may not like admitting it, but human beings respond to incentives. Corporate behavior is shaped by it. Entire economies are built on that fact. Tax systems rely on it. Welfare systems rely on it. Yet somehow, when it comes to family law and child support, we pretend incentives suddenly stop mattering. But they absolutely do matter. Because if one parent receives substantially more financial support, housing support, tax benefits, and reduced economic pressure by retaining majority care of the children, then the system is inevitably rewarding the retention of majority custody. When the financial architecture starts to reward gatekeeping and creates conflict around parenting time, things get very hostile very quickly. Imagine for a moment a utopia in which the reverse model exists. Imagine if parents who unreasonably resisted shared care were financially disadvantaged for doing so. Imagine if the system economically encouraged maximizing meaningful involvement from both parents wherever safely possible. I suspect you would suddenly discover that many custody disputes were not nearly as impossible to resolve as we're led to believe. Because currently the incentives often run in one direction. The parent retaining majority custody, regardless of if that is a man or a woman, that parent frequently receives increased financial support while simultaneously reducing their workforce participation due to caregiving responsibilities. Meanwhile, the paying parent often carries both the economic burden and the emotional burden of reduced time with their children. The system then compounds this dynamic by financially rewarding the continuation of that arrangement. And again, this is not an argument against supporting caregivers, regardless of whether caregivers are women or men. Raising children absolutely comes with sacrifice and economic cost to both mothers and fathers. The question is whether we've built a system that sometimes rewards limiting the involvement of the other parent rather than encouraging cooperative co-parenting and maximizing meaningful relationships with both parents. Because a healthy system should aim to reduce conflict, reduce the perverse incentives, and encourage shared parental involvement wherever safe and practically possible, and not create financial structures that can unintentionally fuel custody battles in the first place. Currently, we are encouraging parental conflict by directly linking greater custody with greater economic advantage, thereby manufacturing and fostering hostility where it doesn't need to exist. So if we decouple financial transfers from custody time, if there is no longer a payment from father to mother or mother to father, based on who has the kids more, how do we actually ensure the children's needs are met? And the answer to this is relatively simple, elegant, transparent, and removes an enormous source of conflict all in one move. And that is that both parents contribute directly to the costs of raising their children, not to each other, but to third parties who actually deliver those goods and services. Let me be concrete about what this means. School fees, health insurance, extracurricular activities, childcare. Both parents pay their share directly to the providers, not to the other parent. Because money for the children should go directly to what the children need, not into the hands of one parent to spend as they choose. Under the current system, child support payments are made from one parent to the other in cash with essentially no accountability mechanisms for how that money is spent. And the receiving parent is not legally obligated to spend child support payments on the child. That's not a theoretical concern, that's a documented reality. When you move to a direct payment model, that problem disappears. The money flows from both parents in proportion to their incomes directly to the service provider. The child gets the school fees paid, gets the health cover, gets the swimming lessons. There is no intermediary. There is no cash transfer between adults that can be spent on something other than the child. There is also no humiliation. One of the things that men in separated families consistently report is the degradation of having to hand over money to a former partner with no accountability, no transparency, and no say. That dynamic corrodes post-separation co-parenting. It breeds resentment. It creates conflict. It is a definition of lunacy. Are we really stupid enough to believe that the best way to minimize parental conflict post-separation is to get one person to pay the other person money without any accountability of what it's being used for? In what world is this supposed to reduce conflict and ill feelings? We can achieve child support by direct third-party payments. That's cleaner. They are fairer. They are more accountable. And they radically reduce the surface area for conflict. And of course, this has to be enforced to ensure no one is shrugging their responsibilities. But that's not different if one parent is paying the other parent or if they're paying a third party. That potential for avoiding payment still exists either way. And that leaves the remaining variable, the day-to-day costs like groceries, clothing, entertainment, household supplies. And those are handled proportionately within each parent's household during their respective care time. Both parents bear those costs during their time. No cash transfer required. That further forces parents to question whether they can support the children in their care and ensures that they have the secure employment to provide for their children, which further removes the financial lever to fight over custody. And before anyone says this is administratively impossible, it's not. Singapore, Germany, several Scandinavian countries operate systems that are far more transparent than the Australian system. In many of these models, child-related payments are tied far more closely to actual child-related costs. Education, healthcare, housing, uniforms, transport, food. Some systems require documented expenses. Some use direct reimbursement models. Some offset costs automatically based on time spent caring for the child. And some operate with significantly greater financial accountability than the Australian system currently demands. We live in an age where your banking app can categorize every coffee you buy. Your phone can track your sleep, your heart rate, your calories, your location, your spending habits in real time. We have AI, we have digital banking, we have instant receipts, we have automated expense tracking, we have child support apps, we have parenting communication apps. We absolutely have the technology and infrastructure to create a system where money allocated for children can be transparently linked to children. But we choose not to. Instead, we operate a system built largely on blind financial transfer between adults. And then we simply hope the money reaches the child in the way that it was intended. And to be clear, many parents absolutely do spend appropriately on their children. Many mothers and fathers sacrifice enormously and do the right thing every single day. But the issue is not whether good parents exist. The issue is whether public policy should rely purely on trust when financial incentives, emotional conflict, separation trauma, resentment, and litigation are all involved. No corporation, government department, or charity would operate this way. Imagine our Prime Minister telling taxpayers, we're going to transfer large sums of money into a loosely monitored account with minimal accountability mechanisms, and we'll simply trust that it's being allocated appropriately. It would never survive public scrutiny. Yet when it comes to separated parents, that is effectively what we do. And then we act surprised when conflict escalates. Because once financial outcomes become tied to custody outcomes, we have created a system where emotion and economics become dangerously intertwined. And when that happens, children risk becoming not just loved family members, but economic variables inside a government formula. Here is one of the most powerful arguments for decoupling custody from financial reward. And it is one that almost never gets discussed in policy debate. When extra custody time does not equal more child support received, the research tells us that parenting time equalizes. Not immediately and not uniformly, but the pattern is clear. When the financial incentive to maximize custody is removed, the dominant driver of care arrangements becomes what it should have always been: who is actually available, who is actually capable, and what genuinely serves the child. When you stop paying people to have custody, the people who genuinely want to be with their children emerge. And as it often turns out, there are two of them. Studies from jurisdictions that have moved towards income share models, where both parents' incomes are considered and contributions are proportional rather than directional, these models show better balanced care arrangements and better co-parenting relationships. When money stops following the nights, something remarkable happens. Parents, particularly mothers, who under the current system face significant financial pressure to maximize their custody allocation, begin making decisions that more accurately reflect their children's needs and their own genuine parenting capacity. Fathers, meanwhile, begin to engage more deeply, because engagement is no longer associated with a financial penalty. Because under the current system, a father who pushes for more time is not just a loving parent, he is, under the system's logic, reducing the mother's income. And of course, that creates opposition, that creates legal battles, that creates trauma. Under a decoupled system, a father who wants more time with his children is simply a father who wants more time with his children. That financial weapon is gone, and the negotiation can be human again. I want to be clear that this is not theoretical idealism. This is the documented outcome of policy reform in jurisdictions that have had the courage to try it. When you remove the financial architecture that rewards adversarial custody battles, those custody battles become less common. Children see more of both parents, and the research across the board is consistent that this produces better long-term outcomes for children across every measurable dimension. Now I want to talk about something that does not get nearly enough attention in the public conversation around child support, and that is voluntary underemployment. Here's a scenario. A relationship ends, both partners were working, one partner, irrespective of gender, but more often than not, the partner who will be receiving child support, makes a calculation. If I reduce my working hours, my assessed income drops. And if my assessed income drops while the other parent's income remains the same or increases, the child support that I receive goes up significantly. Of course, this could work both ways. One parent chooses to be underemployed to avoid paying child support, or works cash in hand such that their income is not registered to the ATO. This practice is absolutely rife throughout the system and tells you everything you need to know about the person's morality and ethics. This is not hypothetical. This is a documented, well-understood dynamic in systems where child support is income assessed with no serious mechanism for attributing imputed income. Voluntarily reducing your income to increase or decrease child support is not a parenting decision, it's a financial strategy. And the system currently enables it. The Australian child support formula does not include a notional imputation provision, the capacity to work provision. But in practice, it is extremely difficult to enforce. The evidentiary threshold is very high. The legal costs of challenging it are prohibitive for most people, and the system defaults to accepting the declared income. And the consequences are profound. Let's take the example of a man who built his family's life around both partners working, whose financial planning was based on dual income. Suddenly, he finds himself assessed under a formula that attributes him full earning capacity, while his former partner is assessed on an artificially reduced one. He cannot reduce his own hours without triggering legal consequences or having accusation leveled against him or his character in the eyes of society. He is effectively locked into full earning capacity while the system refuses to hold the other party to the same standard. Now, of course, this could work both ways, men and women. A genuinely reformed system must address this directly. Both parents should be assessed on their demonstrated earning capacity not simply their declared income. And that should be based on the history of earnings and qualifications. If a parent who was previously employed full-time suddenly reduces to part-time without clear medical or caregiving justification, the system should attribute their prior earning capacity for assessment purposes. Again, this applies both ways to men and women. And this is not punitive, this is parity. If the system imputes full earning capacity for one parent, it must do the same for both. Moreover, any extended reduction in employment should trigger a formal review with genuine evidentiary burden on the reducing parent to demonstrate that the change is genuine and not financially motivated. Germany and some Nordic systems already operate with presumed full-time capacity for both parents, unless there is a documented reason otherwise. Australia should keep with the modern times and adopt the same standard. I want to spend a few minutes talking about binding financial agreements, in terms of it being the contractual protection that men and women are not taking. This section might be the most practically important of this entire episode for those who are either entering or leaving a relationship. Australia's Family Law Act provides two instruments that far too few Australians use: the Binding Financial Agreement, known as the BFA, and the Binding Child Support Agreement, the BCSA. Together, these two documents represent the most legal protections available to a man or woman entering or exiting a relationship. Let me take you through them in order. And I say this not as a legal professional and not in any way licensed to practice law or give legal advice. The Binding Financial Agreement, a BFA, is a legally binding contract between two parties that sets out how assets, liabilities, and financial resources will be divided in the event of a separation. In plain language, it's a prenuptial or a postnuptial agreement that can, if properly drafted, override the default property division provisions of the Family Law Act. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. That's unromantic. That's signaling distrust. If you love someone, you don't plan for the end. And while I have some sympathy for that instinct, it's the very same instinct that can completely destroy your financial future. A BFA is not a plan for your marriage to fail. It is a plan for your children to be protected from a financial war, if it does. In the absence of a BFA, the Family Law Act gives the family court enormous discretion in dividing assets. And that discretion is not always exercised in ways that reflect contribution, effort, or financial reality. Courts can and do make orders that bear little resemblance to what a reasonable person would consider fair. A BFA, properly drafted by independent solicitors acting for each party, which is the legal requirement for a BFA to be binding, allows both parties to define in advance what fair looks like to them. It removes the uncertainty. It removes to a large extent, when properly drafted, the court's discretion, and it protects both parties from outcomes they did not agree to. I want to be clear about the legal requirements because these are non-negotiable. And again, I say this as someone who is not a registered legal practitioner. But a BFA to be binding under Family Law Act requires, firstly, for it to be written and signed by both parties. Secondly, each party must receive independent legal advice from separate solicitors before signing. Third, each solicitor must provide a signed statement confirming that advice was given. And fourth, it must not have been entered into under duress, fraud, or without full financial disclosure. If any of these requirements are not met, the agreement can be set aside by the court. So this is not an area for shortcuts or DIY. Now I want to talk about the Binding Child Support Agreement, which is a second instrument, and this one is critically underused. The Binding Child Support Agreement, or BCSA, is a private agreement between parents that, once executed, is legally binding and replaces the administrative child support formula assessment. It allows both parents to set out in specific terms what child-related financial obligations will look like, how much will be paid, in what form, and for what purpose. Under a BCSA, parents can agree to direct payment arrangements. They can agree that the father or mother pays the school fees directly to the school, that both parents contribute proportionally to health insurance premiums paid to the health fund, that extracurricular costs are split and paid directly to the provider. The direct payment model that I described earlier is not just an aspirational reform. It can be implemented today by any separated couple willing to enter a BCSA. The binding child support agreement is the contractual exit from a broken system. But most men don't know that it exists. Like a BFA, a BCSA requires both parties to receive independent legal advice, and both solicitors must certify that advice was provided. It's a high threshold, and deliberately so, because it removes the safety net of the administrative formula. But here is why it matters. Once a properly executed BCSA is in place, Services Australia cannot override it with an administrative assessment. That binding agreement governs. If the other party later wants to change the terms, they cannot simply apply for a new assessment. They need to go back to you. And if you cannot agree, they have to take it to court to have the BCSA set aside. The legal threshold to set aside a BCSA is very high. And for a person who's exiting a relationship who wants to build a genuinely fair, transparent, and child-focused financial arrangement, the BCSA combined with the BFA on the property side represents the most powerful available toolkit we have today. I also want to say something about timing. The moment most people think about these agreements is usually too late, and that is after separation, when the legal machinery is already in motion and the other party's incentives have already shifted. The time to discuss and formalize these arrangements is before the relationship breaks down, at a time where both of you genuinely love each other and want the best for each other and your children. It's no different to writing a will or an enduring power of attorney. It's simply a matter of legally formalizing your wishes should something unforeseen or unpredictable happen. If you are already in a relationship, you absolutely should be having this conversation now. From a post-nuptial BFA to an agreement about what your financial arrangements would look like if you separated with school-age children. This is not a sign of distrust, doomsday planning, or marital distress. This is simply financial maturity. And it's a conversation that benefits both parties because a clear agreement protects everyone, including the children. It is something that I've done myself with my new partner without any resistance or ill feeling. And if your partner puts up strong opposition against a BFA or BCSA, that in itself gives you some very important information for you to consider carefully. Now I want to spend a little time on one of the most painful aspects of the current system, and one that almost no one in mainstream policy discussion will say plainly, and that is the weaponization of children and custody arrangements for financial gain. I'm not going to pretend this is a gender-neutral phenomenon. The data is clear. In majority of cases where custody is used as a financial lever, the lever is pulled by the primary carer. And in majority, but not all, cases, that primary carer is the mother. Now, this is not an indictment of mothers as a category, but it is what all the statistics in Australia show. It is a statement about what the system incentivizes. Now, to a certain extent, you cannot blame individuals for responding to the incentives that the system creates. Reform the system and the behavior changes. When custody time determines financial outcome, you have created a situation where restricting the other parent's access and making them look like uninvolved, dangerous, or incompetent parent serves a direct financial interest. The adversarial nature of the family court system then provides the arena in which that strategy gets played out. False allegations of family violence or child abuse made in the context of family law proceedings have been the subject of serious concern for decades. A 2020 report from the Australian Law Reform Commission specifically identified the family court as a system that inadvertently creates incentives for tactical use of serious allegations. I want to be absolutely clear. Genuine family violence and genuine child abuse are gravely serious matters that must not be taken lightly. They must be prosecuted fully with the harshest of punishments to the perpetrators of that violence and abuse. Nothing that I'm saying today should be heard or interpreted as minimizing real abuse or real danger. But the weaponization of the family law system, the use of allegations as tactical instruments, is also a form of abuse. It is an abuse of the process. It's an abuse of the system designed to genuinely protect vulnerable people. And it disproportionately harms children who lose meaningful relationships with their fathers as a result. But we won't dive too deeply into this, as I'll be discussing false abuse claims in another episode. The antidote to the current issues is structural. As already mentioned, when custody time has no financial consequences, when a parent can have 100% of the nights and still pay the same proportionate share of direct child costs as they would if they cared 50-50, the financial motivation for custody battles evaporates. When there is no financial reward for keeping the other parent out, when the only question is what serves the child, families find a way to a more functional arrangement more often than the current system allows us to believe. And this is not rocket science. Remove the weapon, and more often than not, the warrior usually lays down their shield. I've been talking a great deal about men, about fathers, about financial justice, and all of that matters. But I want to spend a moment talking about the people who are most harmed by the current system, and who are almost never centered in debate, and that is the children. A child support system that makes fathers financially expendable does not protect children, it deprives them of something irreplaceable. We know with extraordinary clarity from decades of developmental research what children need from their fathers. They need physical presence. They need consistent, repeated, emotionally engaged interaction. They need to experience their father as a source of security, as a source of challenge and love across the full spectrum of childhood. What they do not need is to be handed between parents on a schedule designed around financial calculations. They do not need to grow up in households where animosity towards the other parent is a background radiation of their childhood. They do not need to feel, consciously or unconsciously, that they are the reason for the adult war that's being fought around them. And they absolutely do not need a system that tells their father the less time you spend with your children, the more money you pay, and then wonder why the father disengages. Research on paternal disengagement following separation is quite sobering. A significant proportion of non-resident fathers reduce contact with their children over time. The explanations are complex, but the financial and legal architecture plays a documented role. When every interaction with the family law system is hostile, expensive, and outcome uncertain, when a father has been told repeatedly, explicitly, and implicitly that his role is financial and not relational, many fathers over time retreat. And this retreat costs children enormously. Children who lose meaningful access with their fathers face higher rates of educational underachievement, mental health difficulties, substance use, relationship difficulties in adulthood, amongst others. The child support system, as currently designed, is producing paternal disengagement at scale, and then calling it child protection. And that is the absolute ludicrousness of the current system in Australia. I want to step back for a moment from the mechanics of the reform agenda. For decades, the dominant cultural narrative about separated fathers has been this: you are a check. You have a financial obligation. Your value to your children is measured in dollars, and your primary legal relationship with your children after separation is as a source of income. That narrative has been embedded in legislation, enforced by agencies, and adjudicated in courts. And it has caused immeasurable damage to men, to children, and ultimately to women, who've been burdened with the expectation of sole or primary caregiving in a world where that is no longer sustainable or desirable. But fathers are not walking wallets. They are irreplaceable human beings in the lives of their children. And the law needs to act like it believes that. The child support system is not a side issue for men's advocates. It sits at the intersection of every major challenge facing men in contemporary society. Challenges such as economic vulnerability after separation, disconnection from children, loss of housing stability, mental health consequences, and at the extreme end, the devastating statistics on male suicide in the post-separation period. We know that men die after separation, and they die in disproportionate numbers. And the financial architecture of the child support system, the economic dislocation, the loss of children, the legal helplessness, is part of what drives that. And this is not a political argument, it's a public health argument, it's a child welfare argument, it's a human dignity argument. We can build something better. We can build a system that says to both parents, your children need both of you. Your financial obligations to your children are real, and we will hold you to them. We can build a system that says parenting time is a right and a responsibility, and we will presume that both of you are capable of bearing it unless you can prove otherwise. The question is whether we have the political courage to demand it. So if you are a man listening to this who has been through the family law system, whether it's destroyed your financial situation, cost you time with your children, or left you questioning your own value as a father, I want to say this directly to you. You were not failed by a system that is just a little bit imperfect. You were failed by a system that was not designed with you in mind. A system built on assumptions about gender and money that were already outdated when it was legislated. A system that calls itself child-centered while consistently encouraging and supporting child-harmful outcomes. To those fathers, your anger is legitimate, your grief is legitimate, and your desire for something better for your children, for yourself, for the men who come after you. That is exactly what this conversation needs. The most important thing a father can do for his children is to stay in their lives, and we need to build a system that makes that possible. Here is what I want you to take away from today. If you're entering a serious relationship, talk to a family lawyer about a BFA or a BCSA. Do not rely on informal arrangements that give you no legal protection. If you're a father fighting for time with the children, document everything, keep records, engage with a good lawyer, and know that the research is firmly on your side, that shared parenting is better for children. That is your most powerful argument. If you're a policymaker or a politician listening to this, the data is there. The research is there. The human cost is there. The reform agenda is not fringe. It's rational, evidence-based, and overdue. This podcast was built on the belief that men deserve honest conversations about the hardest things in their lives. Today we talked about child support and about what it means to be a father in a system that often treats fatherhood as a financial category rather than a human one. So stay in the fight, for your kids, for yourself. And for the men who don't yet know that there is a better way. I'm your host, Dr. Vinod. Thank you for staying with me today, and I'll catch you on the next episode.